Hey guys, and welcome back to yet another episode. And folks, this one truly has it all: the sex, the money, the debauchery, the sensationalism. So let's jump right in because we're in for one wild ride, I promise. Our story begins in 1972 with a director by the name of Lucio Fulci, and he has just made a thriller, a film rated R, so 18 and above. And in this picture is a scene where this gorgeous German born actress is naked, and a young child comes in, and she invites him to come closer and to take a good look. And what this scene was meant to do, other than obviously showing off the sexy lady, it was meant to give a glimpse. Remember, this is a thriller film. So it was meant to give a glimpse of the woman's character, this unscrupulous character. And what the director was hoping to do was install, like, he wanted to instill the doubt in his audience that she may just be the killer after all. So, okay, I'm not going to spoil the film, but this is what happened in 1972. And this particular director, he had had legal troubles with his work before. And in the past, he'd had to prove that no animals had been mistreated in this one particular picture that he had made earlier. But this scene, this one here in 1972, with the woman beckoning the young boy, this brought him much worse trouble. He was really in hot water here. So the scene was so scandalous. The movie was released. The scene was so scandalous that firstly it was excommunicated by the Catholic Church, and his crew, and the cast were hauled into court with a very serious charge: corrupting a minor. Okay, so similarly to his previous incident with the animals, what ultimately happened was that all charges against him were dropped when he showed the court the raw footage and then the edited footage. So they were able to see that the child had never actually been in the room with the naked lady. So, I mean, these are the early days of editing, so he actually had to show the court, in a very, very, very sort of kind of like they were 5 year olds. So this is what we do, this is what we actually filmed, and then this is how we put it together, and we can make people who are not in the same room look like they were in the same room, but it's actually all filmed separately, and it's cut and pasted together later. In the film, there was only one shot. Even in the raw footage, this shot appeared, and this was the problematic shot, because it did seem at first that in the raw footage, there was a scene of the child. The child was being filmed from behind, but he did seem to be in the room with the actress, and she had no clothes on. Now, by the time the DA actually relented and dropped the charges, the main actress had actually had to take the stand. So it took a while for the charges to get dropped this time. The actress came into court, and the media by this time had gotten a hold of the story. And this is what one newspaper wrote. In court, the actress defended herself by saying that the alleged child was actually a grown man of very short stature. And this was actually true. The man's name was Domenico Semeraro, but he was better known as Mimmo. and he was 130 centimeters tall, or 4 foot 3 inches tall. He weighed under 50 kilograms, so under 110 pounds, and he has been described by many as having the build of roughly a 10-year-old boy. Now, when we meet him, he is 44 years old and he's dead. Okay, so before we begin, guys, a quick disclaimer. Okay, so we now know that dwarfism is a genetic condition and we've learned a lot about it, but unfortunately, it wasn't always that way. And Italy in the 80s and 90s, it could be a really difficult place to navigate for someone who was quote unquote different. However, to understand this particular story, we really do need to understand how our protagonist saw himself. And this is a protagonist who, despite being undoubtedly successful and doing more things and more interesting things that most people would ever do by the age of 44, and he was also in some ways even well loved in some ways. Despite all of this, he had become so wrapped up in the sense of injustice he felt for having been born with dwarfism and his erroneous conviction that no one would ever see him as anything but a freak, regardless of his achievements, of how far he'd come. This led him down a path of sadism and malice, which, mixed with his lustful desires, led to a tragedy that, frankly, could have been avoided. So I ask you to keep this in mind, okay? Throughout the episode, I will be referring to Mimmo as he unfortunately saw himself. I also wanted to say that in the description box, I'm also linking the channel of Pete Monzingo. I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, he's a 6 foot young man who was born into a family of dwarves. And the reason why I'm linking his channel is because I think he's doing an absolutely fantastic job of destigmatizing this condition. His videos are funny, they're ironic, they're a good laugh. And if you haven't heard of him, please feel free to check out his videos and send him and his family some love. It's 2 p.m. on April 26th, and we have jumped forward in time to 1990. It was a windy morning, and after getting an anonymous tip, the police head to a landfill area in the southeast of Rome, where they find a black bin liner with what appears to be a child's foot sticking out. The face of the body is so battered and bruised that no one could really identify him in this state. But on closer inspection, the investigators detect what seems to be a 5 o'clock shadow. Wrapped tightly around his neck is a blue polka dot scarf, Balenciaga, and he had clearly been strangled with it. But his hair with that obvious comb over, this couldn't be a child. This was a full grown man with dwarfism who had been beaten to a pulp and strangled with his expensive neck scarf. In another nearby sheer black liner, amid the rotting piles of waste, were a pair of miniature slippers and some bloody paper towels. Mimmo had been born in 1946 in the southern town of Ostuni in a family of farmers. Ostuni is in the region of Apulia, down south, and like his sister, Mimmo was the result of a long line of inbreeding. So both he and his sister were affected by dwarfism. Now, their particular condition made it so that they were little, but they were perfectly proportionate, and many would go on to describe their first impression of Mimmo as a mini man. In his youth, Mimmo had worked hard at a gas station. He was saving up for evening classes to get his diploma. He simply had to get away from the snickering and the cruelty of his hometown because his dream was to move to Rome, the capital city, and make it big. It took much effort, but he did finish his studies and he did move to the capital city where he landed a job as a middle school industrial arts teacher. By the time Mimo had actually achieved his dream, he had realized the adult world would always look upon him with suspicion and contempt. And this was especially true at the time. His pupils loved him, the kids loved him, but this couldn't make up for the sense of injustice at having been born the way he was. He had tried to resolve this inner conflict by becoming very, very theatrical. Because if the world saw him as a freak, he would make the world his stage. He would use and he would abuse his condition to get the attention he craved by way of a sort of macabre megalomania. For example, he was once interviewed by a magazine as Italy's smallest teacher. That was the headline of the piece. And he had felt that familiar disappointment. But if he was to be interviewed for the spectacle of it, then why not present himself brashly? This is what he said to the reporter. Quote, I'm different. I know I am. But I shall overtake the greatest and win. I've had many girlfriends, he continued, and they were all tall. I only like very tall women, 2 meters tall, so that would be about 6'5". As long, he continued, as they're super hot. With women, my strategy is sweetness. Now, about Mimmo and women, what we do know is that when he was in his late 20s, he met the lovely Tanya, who was 10 years his junior, and whose family was in a hurry to marry her off. They had met because Mimmo, as was his habit, had taken out a newspaper ad. This one in particular was for a wife. Now, the story goes that after experimenting with her sexually, although we're not really sure how far it went, Mimmo abandoned Tanya to the absolute horror of her family, who swore to avenge her. And 5 months after the article was published, the one titled Italy's Smallest Professor, they reported him for sexual assault. But Mimo was so little, he insisted to the court. I'm so little. How could I have done what I'm accused of, even if I'd wanted to? He told the court that Tanya was tall and strong, and the judges believed him. When he was acquitted, Mimo kind of marveled at this point at just how much he could get away with. All he had to do was pull out the "look at me" card. I obviously couldn't have done that. I obviously couldn't have said that. But he had decided that if people were hell bent on indulging their ignorance and their sense of superiority, why not use it to his advantage? I mean, he knew he would have to fight tooth and nail for everything he got. But at this point he was sort of through with scruples. Why shouldn't he lie and cheat or even exploit his weakness to get what he wants? Mimo's teaching career ended abruptly, officially on account of a nervous breakdown, but unofficially there were rumors. One of his former colleagues would later say about him, quote, I remember him well, a very odd fellow, a concentrate of contradictions, intelligent and with incredible willpower, but perverted and shady. It was said that he'd spy on the girls in the bathrooms and invite the boys to his place to seduce him. End quote. Mimmo was then employed as a librarian for a cinema institute, and that is where he landed his part as a double for the risque scene I described earlier, the one with the German born gorgeous actress beckoning the little boy, the one that landed the director in court. Now, this cameo of his, he would go on to use it relentlessly to tell people how inserted he was into the world of film. And the world of film, incidentally, just happened to be full of young boys and girls who would do absolutely anything to make it in. Instead of through a keyhole in a grimy middle school bathroom, he could now spy on his prey through a viewfinder as they posed for him in the hopes he could help them make it big. Before we continue, I have a very quick announcement. As you may know, the streaming platform Stitcher will soon be no more. But I did want to let you know that my show will still be available on Spotify, on Pandora, on Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Castbox, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public. So I hope to see you there. Even more than sex, Mimmo had always loved beauty. Beautiful bodies, beautiful faces. He who had neither. But overall, the company of people was always a risk. He could be derided or rejected. He tried hard not to show it, but he really did feel different. He preferred the company of animals, which had led to his other passion, the one that had perhaps brought him the most success: taxidermy, the stuffing and mounting of dead animals for display. In Rome, he soon became known as one of the best, and his small hands helped with the more detailed parts of the job. In 1987, Mimmo had a well established natural science and taxidermy lab located in Viale Castro Pretorio, a pretty avenue that runs alongside Termini Station. If you have visited Rome, you'll no doubt have noticed how Termini is the beating heart of the city's transport system. From there, you can take trains to pretty much anywhere, and it is also the only place where you can change between the only two real metro lines. And yes, you heard that right. In a city of 4 million people that spreads over a 500 square mile area, there are only two proper metro lines. They've been building this third one for 15 years, but it only has like five stops. So, um, those only two real metro lines only intersect in one station. However, aside from that, one thing you probably don't want to find out about Termini Station is how grim it could become at night, especially during the 80s and 90s. While I still would highly recommend avoiding that area entirely at night, in the 80s and 90s, it was a hub for lost souls, which came together in the dark looking for sexual favors or looking to give sexual favors to make a quick buck. It was a safe haven for heroin addicts and for the mentally ill. And these people lived alongside the homeless and the muggers and the grifters. At number 30 of Castro Pretorio Avenue, Mimmo had two adjoining apartments, number 4 and number 5. And these were respectively his lab and his home. And it was in this elegant building that he would spruce up for his nights out on the town. He would carefully select a suitable accessory from his drawer full of delicately folded net scarves before adding a finishing touch of perfume and making his way to the station. Mimmo was well known in the world of male prostitution, which he made assiduous use of. He was always well dressed, and he would never let anyone accompany him to the only tailor he trusted with making his expensive suits. After all, the world awaited him, and he liked to surprise his audience with a fabulous entrance. The people at the station knew him as the dwarf of Termini Station, and they also knew of his tendency to try to seduce young men. He had no beauty to offer them, but he could give them money, opportunities, protection, and some tender, loving care in exchange for their company. One of his better known tricks was apparently to look around for a young man who seemed at a loose end and not totally repulsed by his suggestive glances. He would then approach him with a cigarette, asking for a light. If the initial contact went as planned, the boy might then get handed a business card that read Domenico Semeraro, middle school teacher, beauty expert, taxidermist, collector of scientific material, deputy commissioner for the wildlife guard, pro nature counselor for the local hunting committee, lover of super science and the occult. Wow. But then, in an offhand manner, he would also mention that he only lived a few blocks away, and the implicit deal was made. Mimo would shower them with drugs, with attention and expensive gifts in exchange for their bodies. It wasn't uncommon for him to show his dominance by giving his lovers pet names like Fluffy or Marshmallow, almost as if they were his little lapdogs. When he took them back to their lab, they couldn't but look around in a macabre fascination of sorts. It was full of stuffed owls, squirrels, hawks, and foxes stared at them from the shelves. And on the workspaces, there were scalpels, there were beakers, there was a musty odor of chemicals in the air. And it is only when they walked into apartment 5, so Mimo's living space, that they would start to notice that everything was small. The chairs, the tables, the furniture, they were all tailored to his size, including the desk on which he had placed his computer. In that desk was a drawer that Mimo was filling to the brim with Polaroids he was taking of boys and girls in graphic poses, engaged in the most unbridled sexual abandon. Whether or not his catch suspected it, he, or occasionally she, was about to become the latest addition to his collection. Mimo was cultured. He was intelligent and he was very talented at more than one thing. But his constant need to prove himself to himself and to others had resulted in an outward appearance of an enormous ego. Besides hunting at night time at Termini Station, he was using his cinema cameo and his position at the Institute of Cinema to lure in his victims by taking out newspaper ads. Ads for film auditions, for dancers, even for office assistants, really anything that might appeal to a down and out youngster with distracted parents, a pretty young thing willing to do anything he asked on the off chance that they might actually make it big. When his doorbell rang on the morning of June 26th, 1987, Mimo didn't know it, but his fate was sealed. When he opened the door, in front of him was Armando, a tall, bony 18-year-old with dark curly hair. He was here for the ad Mimo posted, the one for the handyman. His parents won't buy him the Honda motorcycle so desperately wants, Armando says. So he's come to see about getting a summer job while school is out. Mimmo, with his lover from the previous night still in bed, is taken aback. In his journal, he wrote, quote, "Who in the world ever possessed such charm? His big, bright eyes with those long lashes of sparkling black, small, rosy, meaty lips, and teeth as white as cream. He has the face of a mythical legend and a slender, sinuous body that awaken the deepest kind of eroticism." End quote. The man still in Mimo's bed that morning was nicknamed the Rat because of his protruding teeth. His liaison with Mimmo had yielded him two mopeds, and although he would still come round occasionally, henceforth there would only ever really be room for Armando. For his part, Armando didn't think too much of Mimmo. He seemed courteous, that's all. And despite his secret underground lifestyle, the 40-year-old man managed to make a good impression on Armando's mom when she came to meet him the next day. They even found out that they had both worked at one particular place, and his parents decided that nothing really seemed amiss. Nothing like a good summer job to give this boy some direction and a chance to work for what he wants, they thought. Mimmo is in immediate adoration of the boy who, however, at the beginning sees him as nothing more than a benefactor, a harmless benefactor, or a friend, maybe even a father figure who can grant him access to the type of luxury he never really thought he'd see. So he just thought he'd gotten really lucky. And every time Armando fought with his parents, with whom he just couldn't really seem to get along, Mimmo was his guide, his you can tell me anything type of guy, always ready to listen and advise him. He was like a young plant blowing in the wind, Mimmo had once told him. And Armando was becoming dazzled in a way by Mimmo's personality and, let's face it, his lavish lifestyle and his expensive gifts. Armando was young, while Mimo had so much experience with so many things. He had been in a movie, he had been on the papers, he was intelligent, he had lots of ideas and lots of easy ways to make a quick profit. And his knowledge in so many different fields made him appealing to the boy. Mimo was smooth and confident, and he seemed to be able to talk to girls like Armando never really thought he could. And he began to feel that he had so much to learn. Now, the day that Mimmo introduced Armando to heroin, because he did, he was wearing his best suit. Before Mimmo, Armando had never really dabbled too much in drugs, but this was part of a long history Mimmo had of drugging people to control them, to keep them close, and of course, to abuse them. When Armando came over one day after yet another row with his father, Mimmo listened quietly. Armando was an adult now, he said, and his father would eventually realize that he had to make his own experiences, like the one, he continued, that he was offering right now, a magic potion, an occult remedy to access the hidden corners of our mind. Most people now agree that this was nothing but a drink laced with benzodiazepine, a sedative that can cause disinhibition and sexual arousal. Armando later said that when Mimmo offered him something, whenever he offered him one of his potions, he tried it without thinking too much about it, as per usual. And it was his tendency not to overanalyze, according to him, that prevented him from seeing what was really going on. But it was too late now. As the heavy dose slowly enveloped Armando into confusion and incapacitation, Mimmo was finally free to undress him, to caress him, and to indulge in all his wildest fantasies as he obsessively snapped Polaroids of the helpless boy before removing his own clothes and taking by force what the world would never have otherwise given him. It was 3 p.m. on a hot summer afternoon, and Armando's father was getting increasingly annoyed. His son's lunch was still on the table, where the cold food had been sitting for hours. And when Armando finally returns home, he does so with a motorcycle helmet in his hand. Where has he been? His father wants to know. He has only known Mimo for 2 weeks. How could he be spending all his time with him? And when his father asks about the helmet, Armando says he finally has his Honda. Mimo, he explains, needed it for his farm, so two birds with one stone. What kind of good, decent job pays for a $2,000 bike in the space of 2 weeks? His father asks, unaware that Mimo had actually paid a total of $3,000 after adding every possible custom feature. And that is in today's money. But to buy the bike, Mimmo had sold off the two mopeds he'd bought for his previous lover, the rat. So I guess little harm done. But Armando and his father's argument escalates, and his father slaps the boy across the face, which causes him to storm out crying, shouting that Mimo had been right all along. He warned his parents that he would never be back, and he essentially moved out right there and then. Concerned about their son, Armando's parents tried to report him for coercion, but for a number of reasons, their claim was not enforceable. Desperate, they even tried to break into Mimo's apartment in the hopes of getting their son back, but they achieved nothing except getting sued for trespassing. So, Mimmo was increasingly using drugs to keep Armando all to himself, and the boy's parents were left to watch him spiral into substance abuse, and he also dropped out of school. While Mimmo, on the other hand, couldn't have been happier to share his flat with Armando, as he called him in his private writings, my little merman. In public, Mimo introduced Armando as his nephew, part father figure, part lover, I guess. And after Mimo's death, Armando would say that to him, Mimo had meant transgression. He hadn't seen his family for weeks, but that cushy reality was something he didn't want to leave, and he would silently wish that his parents would just come around. And this indecisiveness played a big role in what ended up happening. The following is the text from an ad Mimo had taken out on a broadsheet. Quote, managerial firm looking for new faces, boys and girls, to introduce into the entertainment world. We sponsor auditions, bands, and young singers. End quote. It was clearly meant to draw in some fresh meat. At the same time, Mimo had been looking for a secretary for his taxidermy lab for a while now. The ad he had placed for that job was directed specifically to women, some of whom he had already discarded because they were incompetent, or even more outrageous to him, not pretty enough. Enter a girl we'll call Samantha, a dashing 16-year-old blonde looking for a job. Like Armando, she came from one of the city's poorest areas. And although Mimmo himself was imperfect, he tended to expect perfection and he was very harsh in his criticism. But Samantha seemed like the ideal candidate. She came from a broken home and she lived with her stepbrother, as well as her father, who, however, was too immersed in his acting career to pay any attention to her. But unlike the zombie like beings that gravitated around Mimmo's apartment, Samantha was strong. And Mimo soon realized she wasn't as easy to manipulate as the people he picked up at Termini Station at night, as the drug addicts that usually hung around him. But she finally did relent to his advances, and he must have thought that he'd won yet again, although in truth, he had just signed his own death warrant. Now, although he much preferred men, Mimo didn't disdain the company of women, and Samantha soon agreed to take part in his sexual games, letting herself be photographed in explicit poses with other girls and boys. Years later in court, when she described their first meeting, she said, quote, Mimmo immediately disgusted me, not because of his height, but because he was a repugnant character, shady, domineering, and full of malice. End quote. Armando now essentially lived with Mimmo, and Samantha also spent most of her time there, and the already fuzzy boundaries started to get even fuzzier as their sexual encounters became more frequent. Mimo would drug the pair with Valium and start photographing them as the action began. At first, Armando and Samantha weren't sure about what was happening, but they soon grew accustomed to him watching them, snapping pictures. The Polaroid ejecting the photographs quickly is no longer the only noise. As Mimo starts telling Armando what to do to Samantha, he starts using him as a puppet, imagining what it would be like to have his looks and his young body. The spark of love, the kind that ignites spontaneously between two people. Perhaps that's all that Mimo had ever wanted. He, of all people, who had become so convinced that love could only be bought or extorted. One night, in the dimly lit apartment at number 30, Castro Pretorio Avenue, Mimo was taking pictures of Armando and Samantha as usual. The dark streets were quiet, but inside, the atmosphere seemed different. Yes, they were obeying his commands, but the pair seemed different, more mesmerized by each other than by him, by their patron, their guide. Their gestures had lost that thin veneer of embarrassment. What he was witnessing seemed more natural. Had he made a huge mistake? Had he set the object of his desire up with the woman who would steal his heart and crush Mimmo in the one battle he could never win? He stood there in silence, shaking the last picture, the one that immortalized his latest defeat. The dangerous love triangle continued, and in 1988, Mimo took the pair on vacation at his mansion in his hometown, a beautiful sea town down south. Armando had been there before during a vacation he has no memory of because Mimo prepared mescaline for him and a bunch of other boy toys. But rumor has it that this time, part of the reason for the trip was for Samantha to have her pregnancy illegally terminated. She was apparently inconsolable for days afterwards, and Mimmo, blinded by jealousy and by a sense of entitlement, started to resent how much attention Armando was giving her. He didn't want Mimmo to take him to the beach or out on the town, and he wouldn't give him, his mentor, who was paying for all his shit, the time of day. But Mimmo decided he'd had enough. He couldn't send Samantha away without risking losing Armando as well. But unlike the boy who was easily manipulated, she was clever and always seemed to be able to predict his next move. And Armando wasn't being any help at all. That familiar inconclusiveness had gotten a hold of him. He wanted to be with Samantha, but he couldn't let Mimmo go. Still in Mimmo's mansion for the summer, Samantha was alone in her bed when all of a sudden the door flew open. 4 feet and 3 inches of pure rage burst into her room. Mimmo was holding a whip high above his head as he made his way over to the terrified girl. She tried to scream, but he pounced on top of her and started ripping off her clothes, shouting that he demanded to have her now. She was nothing but a whore on his payroll, and it was high time everyone, including Armando, knew that. Attracted by all the commotion, Armando flew into Samantha's room, where he found Mimmo beside himself, screaming at her that knowing she had been pregnant was turning him on. I went on holiday with Mimmo to his hometown, Samantha would later testify. It was a holiday of sex and drugs, but I will say this: I never let that man dominate me completely. I never became one of his slaves. That night, Armando had gotten between Mimmo and Samantha, and it was the first time he had ever rebelled against his master. What followed is an absurd series of vendettas. Samantha reported Mimmo for dealing drugs and for sexual assault, and he responded by suing her for slander. He took the picture that he took of her over to the police to show that they clearly had a certain simpatico, if you will, and that was enough for her to take the accusations back. But by 1989, this warped trio had been together for about 2 years, and by now it was clear to Armando, but even more so to Samantha, that the blackmail thing would always be on the table and that those pictures, those Polaroids, would never go away. Mimo had even threatened to put them up at her school. But the following year, as it tends to do, something would change. And it would change more precisely on Monday, February 26th of 1990, when Samantha gave birth to Armando's baby girl. At this point, Samantha's family immediately told the pair, "Move in with us. Armando can finish his studies and you guys can raise your daughter together in a safe environment." And at this point, Armando at times seemed over the moon. He was having a baby, he was in love with Samantha, but there were hints that he missed the thrill of what Mimmo could offer him. The night that Samantha had given birth, he actually wasn't by her side. He was at Mimmo's doing drugs. And the next day, when he should have gone to declare himself as the father, he hadn't done that. And there was a sense that he was beginning to grapple with the reality of parenthood at 20. But it wasn't just that. Mimmo had been trying to convince him that Samantha was having affairs with other men behind his back. But when Armando had refused to leave her, Mimmo had told him he had connections to the mob, which he didn't. And in a desperate attempt to scare Armando into staying with him, he even told him that he'd once killed and dissolved a male prostitute in acid after he had tried to leave him. He was really pulling all the stops out to try and turn back time. And when his lies didn't work, he would fly into these verbal attacks in which he called Armando a traitor and listed everything the boy would lose by leaving him. He had bought him clothes and cars. He had even put Armando's name on his credit card and made him the beneficiary of his life insurance. Mimo was feeling increasingly lost, and in a last ditch attempt to tip the scales in his favor, he had even made Armando, as I said, the beneficiary of his life insurance, but really nothing was working. While Armando was home with his girl and his newborn daughter, Mimo would just sob quietly amid his stuffed animals, releasing his frustration in the only way he could, that is, his journals. There was a popular song at the time that said, quote, "It's night, but I can't sleep. I'm thinking of your green eyes that no longer look my way." End quote. In his journal, Mimo wrote, "Yours are black, but it doesn't matter." At this point, he was having little contact with Armando, who mostly came over only in the mornings and just for work. He decided to write him a letter. Mimo said, "You must be free. And the only way you can be free is if you're away from your family and from that woman who has such a hold on you, and you keep falling into her net like a jackass. Have you noticed that each time you two fight and you leave, she calls me looking for support? But when you're between her legs, when has she ever called me or thought of me at all? You'll get old and dry, Armando," Mimo rages on. "With dead eyes. Gone will be that pretty spark that now brightens up my house." Then, almost prophetically, he adds, "Your woman, that treacherous viper, she will disrespect you and you won't be able to contain yourself. An impulse will cause you to explode, and you might even kill her, defeated by rage and desperation. Prison doors will open for you, and that is my prophecy." April 24th was the night before Mimo's death. He had received no response to his letter, but he would not be ignored. He gets into his van and drives over to Samantha's place, ringing the intercom incessantly, searching for Armando. It's the dead of night, but Mimo is outside with headlights blaring, honking his horn at full volume until the neighbors complain. He then makes it past the main entrance. Samantha and Armando can hear him bounding up the stairs as they barricade themselves into the baby's room at the back of the house. They can hear Mimo banging on their front door, and they have no choice but to sit quietly until he leaves. Mimo had not only threatened to show Armando and Samantha's parents their filthy pictures, he'd also tried to convince Armando Samantha's baby was actually his. But even knowing his dangerous obsession with him, Armando just couldn't let Mimo go. And he couldn't stop thinking about the part of his letter which read, quote, "Your future is to be happy," waving from a fast motorbike and saying, "Come on, let's go for a ride," while pulling expensive cigarettes out of your trendy leather jacket. The next day, April 25th, was a national holiday in Italy, and Armando had spent the entire day with Mimmo, indulging in all the pleasures of the flesh once again, wondering if moving in with Samantha had been worth it after all. Mimmo should have been grinning. His little birdie seemed to have flown back to him, but his jealousy just wouldn't let him rest. Although Armando had half agreed to leave with him for his hometown that very night, leaving Samantha and the baby behind, there was something he just couldn't get out of his head. Samantha had confessed to him that she had once seen Armando engaged in sexual activities with another man in the bathroom at her house. Mimo needed to know. Was it true? Had she said it just to get a rise out of him? He wasn't sure at this point he could tolerate the idea of Armando having cheated on him with another man, of having ventured into the world of male eroticism without him. When Samantha pulled up in a taxi, Armando had already sniffed some heroin. He ignores her as she walks in, intent on fixing a broken motorbike Mimmo had on his property. Mimmo and Samantha start arguing, while Armando just wishes it could all just stop. Why couldn't Samantha let him have Mimmo, and why couldn't he let him have her? Why couldn't he love two people at the same time? Why did he have to choose? Tell me what you want to do, Samantha was shouting from the living room, and Mimmo also wants him to decide. In his tiny slippers, he seems to want to end this as much as she does. Could this be happening? Mimo thinks to himself. Could he really be about to lose it all? Armando is in a world of his own. He doesn't want to be involved in what he perceives as their argument. According to his own words, this is what happened in the subsequent moments. Fearing that Armando would leave, Mimo stood in the doorway when he saw the pair heading for the exit. The 44-year-old man was insisting they resolve this issue before anyone would be allowed to go. Armando was feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The heroin had kicked in pretty good, and the last thing he wanted to do was force a decision that he just couldn't make. He turned away from Mimo and headed back towards the fridge to grab a drink, having absolutely no intention of addressing the problem. The way he saw it, as long as they were willing to fight over him, and thus as long as he could enjoy them both, he would, and maybe fate would make that decision for him. Mimmo was at the end of his rope. Armando had played with him long enough. He had benefited from his presence long enough. He had received money, gifts, and opportunities. And Mimo decided he would demand to be listened to. He would not be ignored by a boy who he had taken in, who he had set up with Samantha, who had stayed at his house for months and was now high on his stuff, and who clearly thought he could once again turn away from the man who'd made him. Mimmo grabbed a scalpel. He tried to attack Armando from behind, but Samantha saw him approaching and yelled out to Armando, who turned around to see him coming at him with a scalpel, in a state in which there was no telling what he would do. At the sight of that, just like Mimmo had prophesied, Armando snapped. All the hostility and frustration he had put him through, the blackmail, the lies, the harassment, he could feel it all festering in his chest. In one fell swoop, he grabbed Mimo by the throat and lifted him clean off the ground with his right hand. Without saying a word, with his left hand, he grabbed the net scarf Mimo was wearing, the blue polka-dotted Balenciaga piece, and pulled it tight until Mimmo took his last breath, at which point the slippers fell off his lifeless feet in silence. Armando was now alone with the corpse, as Samantha had run out onto the street when she had seen the men were coming to hands. She was waiting on the street by the brass plaque that read Igor Taxidermist. And when a beat cop asked her what she was doing there, she said she was a prostitute waiting for clients. Upstairs, Armando, still seething, throws Mimmo's body onto the ground and proceeds to kick him and stomp on his face with his boots, which had thick metal spikes. And he only stopped when he finally collapsed from exhaustion. When Samantha saw Armando come out onto the street, he told her what happened, and he took two black bin liners out of Mimo's van, which was parked just up front. He went back upstairs and tried to clean up a little with some paper towels, which he threw in a bin liner along with Mimo's slippers, and slipped the dead body into the other bag. At 6:15 a.m., Armando's parents were woken up by a phone call. It was Samantha calling to inform them that they had killed Mimmo. When their son came on the line, he asked if he could have the keys to their holiday home so he and Samantha could bury the body. But the parents declined. And shortly after Armando hung up, they called the police on their own son. After wandering around for a few hours, Armando and Samantha came up on that landfill in the southeast of Rome, where we started our story that windy morning. When the police came to arrest the pair, they found them asleep together, holding each other tight. Samantha was 20 and Armando 21, and their daughter would turn exactly 2 months old that very day. At the trial, Armando insisted he was alone in the room when he killed Mimmo, and that he had done it to defend himself and Samantha after years of harassment and abuse. "I'm sorry I killed him," he said, "but there was nothing else I could do. If I hadn't, sooner or later he would have been the one to kill me, and I'm sure I did a lot of people a favor." A year earlier, when the police had caught him, he had confessed by saying, "I killed a creep that can't hurt anyone anymore." Domenico Semeraro's behavior, no doubt, was deemed scandalous, but there was an underlying pity for his condition. When his sister, who was also born with the same condition, took the stand, she said Armando and Samantha had been taking advantage of a poor fellow who was so desperate to find love that he was even willing to buy it. She said she believed the killing was premeditated and motivated by the life insurance policy her brother had put in Armando's name. Many of Mimo's old lovers also unleashed their indignation on the pair, saying they were talking like this now, but they had benefited from many of Mimo's favors. It was no secret that the men Mimo picked were treated very fairly, and if they played their cards well, they could make a lot of money and come across a lot of opportunities that for many other people were simply out of reach. Armando's parents, instead, openly told the court that their son was weak, and they believed Mimmo had taken advantage of that by psychologically enslaving him and subduing him with drugs. On the 13th of May, 1991, Armando was sentenced to 15 years in jail. The court found the motive was entirely psychological, and Armando had killed in a fit of rage. Samantha was not deemed to have participated in the actual murder, and she only got a 1-year sentence for concealing a body, even though this was later modified on appeal, where the court tried to give her a 9-year prison term for murder. But in the third and final proceeding, she was acquitted once again, while Armando's 15-year punishment was confirmed. After his conviction, Armando gave an interview in which he mentioned Mimmo's particular ability to instill doubt in other people. In his now famous letter to Armando, Mimmo had cautioned him, quote, "If you stay there playing man of the house, even if you can find a proletarian job, you're worth nothing in this society. $1,000 a month for 10 hours work to support 3 people. You wouldn't even be able to buy yourself a joint." End quote. Then he had played his last card. Quote, if you want to help your daughter, you can do it from the outside without needing to be a slave in the hands of that witch. End quote. Armando explained that while he couldn't give Samantha up, he couldn't work for 1K a month either. Mimmo had successfully infected him with his love of the finer things. Part of what started the fight that night, according to him, was the fact that Mimmo had managed to extract a promise from him that he would never see Samantha again. Armando said he had let Mimmo convince him. It was almost starting to seem like the logical thing to do. But he eventually did go home for a meal before ditching Samantha and the baby once again to hurry back to Mimmo's, who was livid when he found out Armando had broken his promise. He said when the killing happened, he realized what he was doing, but he couldn't stop himself. It was the only time in his life he ever got really angry, the only time he lost it and just couldn't hold himself back. Armando was always very candid about the fact that he really did care for Mimmo and that his inability to choose likely contributed to what finally happened. He admitted that for a long time he had told both Mimmo and Samantha that he would give the other one up for them, and the real tragedy, he said, was that he was being honest with both. If he could have found a way to keep the positive aspects of both, he would have taken it in a heartbeat. In the end, Armando is sorry for killing Mimmo. He really is, although he doesn't regret ending that reality. In 1994, he told a reporter that love is as strong as hate. They're strong emotions that don't just go away. He has conserved both his love and his hate for Domenico Semeraro. Bitonto, like Ostuni, is a town in the region of Puglia, the proverbial heel of the Italian boot. After a disturbing string of infanticides that had been unsettling the area for months, in which the victims were found lifeless in water tanks and wells, the local DA signed an arrest warrant for a 59-year-old woman who would become known as Grandma Beast. She was only accused of one of the child murders, and it was the killing of her 1 month old grandson, who she had thrown and left to die in a well filled with putrid, stagnant water. Grandma Beast was the grandmother to 3 of the 5 murdered children, who had all been between 1 month and 5 years of age. It was June 1972, and a director by the name of Lucio Fulci decides he's going to make a movie about the recent events involving Grandma Beast, whose real name was Maria Giuseppina Semeraro. He was going to make it a particularly saucy thriller, so much so that he would somehow need to find a double for a 10-year-old boy if he wanted to shoot the scene he had in mind without being sent away for eternity. You may have picked up on the fact that the director and the film I'm referring to are the same ones I opened the episode with. The one that Mimmo the one that made Mimmo into a movie star, or at least that's how he would describe it. You may also have noticed that Mimmo and Grandma Beast not only shared a surname, Semeraro, but they were both from the region of Puglia. It was Grandma Beast that inspired Lucio Fulci's film and gave Mimmo the part, which in turn gave him what he needed to take in the boys and girls who initially believed his lies, only to find themselves stuck in a spiral of humiliation and deceit. 12 years after his murder, Mimmo was immortalized in a 2002 Italian film called The Embalmer, which moves a little off from the original facts of the story, but it does a good job of preserving the toxic triangle that had developed between Mimmo, Armando, and Samantha. Or so I've heard. When the film was released, Armando tried to have it banned by pleading the right to be forgotten, but he was unsuccessful. He died in 2017 at the age of 49. So there you have it, folks. News becomes cinema, and cinema becomes news. To all those who've made it this far, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me with your time. This has been you walking through a Mediterranean nightmare.